contingency always ends up. So now we come on to the fourth and final lecture, Changing Concepts of the Subject, and please join with me in welcoming Professor Seeley.
Well, thank you, Annabelle. Well, that's the final one. So I think that this last lecture can provide a kind of backbone for the whole series, okay? Probably it is the most complex one too. Well, it is we are gonna see the changing concepts of the subject. I will follow here, or what Foucault would call an archaeology of the modern subject. The main goal of this archaeology of the modern subject is to observe the wide diversity of conceptions of subjectivity that are normally fused into that common label of the modern subject. Well, it becomes manifest as soon as we analyze their respective epistemic foundations. An archaeological approach thus intends to make effective that sense of discontinuity in intellectual history that the theories we analyzed in the previous lectures intended to develop, and in this fashion to help to prevent conceptual anachronisms. In short, it aims to disclose the contingent nature of the foundation of the concept of subject, while it is not a natural, eternal entity. Well, you're liking. Okay, that's the best thing of the lecture. Now, we will concentrate here on Foucault's early work and his provocative announcement of the death of the man, or the death of the subject, and try to understand what he meant by that, the meaning of that statement, which most of his critics and also his followers missed. I would like to start with the work by Alain de Libera, Archaeologie du Sujet, which is a good example of it. De Libera intended to elaborate the Foucauldian archaeological project by recovering the ancient and medieval antecedents of the modern concept of the subject, the ego cogito, the agent of its thoughts. But far from leading us to accept the pre-modern origins of that concept, the ego cogito, it raises doubts regarding that very definition. If we could find antecedents of it in the ancient and medieval periods, that could reveal that that definition fails to grasp what distinguishes the modern concept of the subject from the preceding ways of conceiving it. Actually, what de Libera makes is exactly the opposite to Foucault's proposal. Foucault sought to understand the particular type of discourse in which the concept of the subject could emerge, and thus to show why, if detached from the epistemic ground on which it was founded, that concept lacks meaning. In fact, de Libera reformulates the archaeological project in a diachronic sense, that is, archaeology as a search for the precursors, and it makes it indiscernible from that tradition of history of ideas which Foucault's project sought to counter. De Libera's first confusion leads to another. He says that he seeks to combine Heidegger's idea with Foucault's. He understands that the former established what the origin of the modern subject was, that is, the Cartesian subject, to which Foucault would refer. But in actual fact, it is the opposite. Heidegger's perspective about the origins of the modern subject is actually the main target of Foucault's criticism. Contrarily to Heidegger, in The Order of Things, Foucault sought to show why it is not possible to find a concept of the man as a subject in the 17th and 18th centuries. It is a later construction of the 19th century, and to demonstrate it is the core of his archaeological project. In The Age of Word Picture, Heidegger elaborated on the etymological roots of the term subjectum. This is, he stated, the Latin translation of the Greek word hypokaimeno, to which Aristotle refers in his Physics and Metaphysics. The subjectum indicates the substratum of predication, that which underlies and holds together all its predicates. Its function is analogous to matter, Hewlett, which persists throughout the changes of form which are imposed upon it. Anything or being from which we could predicate something was a subject in the ancient world. The identification of the subject with the I or the self initiated by Descartes marked for Heidegger the starting point of the modern world. Foucault instead distinguishes that concept of the subject, which is the one of the classical period, from the modern subject, properly speaking. He was certainly thinking here on Hegel's opening words in the Phenomenology of Mind. Everything depends, I am quoting, everything depends on grasping and expressing the absolute, not as substance, but as subject as well. The subject here at stake, which is no longer merely a substance, is a reflexive concept, the subject and object of itself. As Hegel said, I quote, the very process of positing itself or the mediation of its becoming another one, end unquote. Only then we could speak properly of a modern subject in the sense Foucault gives to the term, far from being that which remains unmodified under the changes of form that are imposed upon it, a same self-substance, as Heidegger stated. It is a kind of being that contains within the principle of its own transformations. The point here is that the merging of this concept marks a crucial conceptual rupture, a fact that Heidegger's view leads to obliterate. It coincides, in fact, with Koselleck's idea of the subtle side, the period from 1750 to 1850 when, for Koselleck, the modern age began. It is associated for Koselleck to the emergence of that new concept of temporality, from which the idea of history as a singular collective noun, a reflexive concept, was produced. The Enlightenment idea of progress is for him the expression of the new living experience of temporal irreversibility. We could say that Foucault combines Koselleck's and Heidegger's insights. Koselleck's concept serves as a corrective to Heidegger's view of modernity, which remains too vague, since it misses the break produced during the subtle side. Conversely, Heidegger's elaborations help to observe a problem in Koselleck's perspective, which misses in turn the epistemic break produced 2 centuries before the subtle side. Consequently, the two fuse different epochs, which, as Foucault shows, contain different concepts of the subject into the same label, that of modernity. Foucault thereby introduces a perspective more accurate and sensitive to the historical transformations on the level of the horizons of meaning within which concepts can deploy. The basic problem in Koselleck's perspective is that insofar as he associates modernity with a given concept of time as an irreversible course, he is obliged to leave out of it the whole range of philosophies of the early modern period, which, it is true, lacked a concept of history as an irreversible course. As a matter of fact, the crucial achievement of the early modern age was precisely the development of a notion of temporal reversibility. This notion was summarized by Pierre Laplace, who completed the Newtonian system, and his hypothesis of the little level, which says that the one who could know the whole universe in its present state will have all the past and the future before his eyes. Thus, he led the Newtonian system to its last consequences. Indeed, time is not the constitutive element of the physical universe. The asymmetry between past and future results only from the limitation of our cognitive capacities. For a superior mind, there would be nothing unknowable or unpredictable. In Newton's astronomy, if we know the present position of the stars and the planets, we can know exactly where they were 1,000 years ago and where they will be in the next 1,000 years. The same matrix of thought can also be observed in the field of the natural history of the Enlightenment. Biology didn't exist at that time. It was founded on the preformationist idea of the development of the embryo. According to the theory first elaborated by Marcello Malpighi, if we isolate the hypothesis of a continuous supernatural intervention of the formation of an organism, we must assume that all its subsequent states were already contained in its germ. In the 17th century, the development of the microscope by Leeuwenhoek permitted the discovery of the spermatozoid, and it was believed to be seen the adult individual already perfectly preformed in it. The discovery by Swammerdam of the preformation of the butterfly in the chrysalid seemed to confirm that hypothesis. It consolidated a fixed view of nature. Up to then, it was thought that the transmutation of beings like metals for the alchemists was possible. And that was the precondition in turn for Linnaeus' taxonomical project. It was first necessary that the universe lose its mobility so that its underlying order, the chain of being, could be fixed. If beings change in the course of their gestation, only the reintroduction of the presence of a superior tutelage presiding over its development could guarantee the systematic reproduction of the order of living species. Only the elimination of the idea of change allowed the conception of a world that is ordered according to its own inherent mechanism, and thus to make possible the formulation of universal laws. Leibniz provided the philosophical ground for this undertaking. He took on the scholastic distinction between fulguratio and evolutio to differentiate the genesis of a form of life which could only emanate from God and its subsequent unfolding. The order and structure of the universe was thus established once and forever. In fact, only the fixed concept allowed Leibniz to reduce God's action exclusively to the moment of the creation and to conceive nature as a system, the idea of a mechanismus universale. Now, this regime of knowledge rested on the basis of a fundamental opposition. The absolute determinacy of the processes stood in opposition to the absolute indeterminacy of the original states. Newton's astronomical system, again, is an example. Its goal was to grasp the whole structure of the universe, but it never asked how it came to be as it is. That question was supposed to lead outside the realm of reason. In fact, all explanation by causes refer back to another cause, and so to the infinite. It has implicit the presence of a first and caused cause, which is beyond the realm of reason. The universe, like a clock, works according to its own mechanism, but it demanded someone to create it. Unlike it is normally thought, behind the Enlightenment rationalism lies a substratum of theological thinking. This was the premise for the conception of the subject as the same self-substance that Heidegger spoke about. Eventually, this opposition between origins and subsequent developments could appear as a crucial shortcoming in this regime of knowledge. By mid-18th century, Diderot could thus affirm that, I quote, only one error is enough to destroy all our knowledge. And it is revealing of the decomposition of the classical conceptual universe. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is an expression. Its subtitle, or the modern Prometheus, illustrates it. Prometheus was the one who stole the fire of life from the gods. A new program for knowledge was thus taking form. To penetrate that so far unthinkable, to still got the mystery of life, of the origin, how things came to be as they are. Well, at that moment, a new series of disciplines started to strip off the idea of life from its former mystical connotations. It was thought that life could be reduced to physical, demonstrable substances or imponderable fluids. Actually, Mary Shelley devised his Frankenstein after having heard of Galvani's experiments, who by applying minor electrical shocks made the legs of dead frogs jump again. Electricity was then one of the candidates to be the primordial substance of life. For Mesmer, it was magnetism, for Goethe, light. On the other hand, the emergence of physiology gave the idea of finality of final cause new scientific credibility. It showed that the development of an organ like a liver was subordinated to the function it had to perform. That was a huge debate between the form and function at that moment. There are some anecdotes on that. Well, these new disciplines provided the substratum for the conception of the evolutionary teleological philosophies of history of the period. They are commonly identified with an organicist view. However, this affirmation says nothing yet, since we still don't know what the idea of organism that the authors of the time had in mind was. This leads us back to Koselleck and his idea of subtle sign. It actually fuses two very different ideas of temporality, those of progress and evolution. The concept of evolution, unlike the progress is associated to the emergence of qualitatively new forms of life. It was first elaborated in the field of embryology. The key figure here was Carl von Baer. He combined the vitalist concept of progressive formation with Cuvier's idea of the formative plan to elaborate a model of embryonic development according to which the germ evolves through a series of stages. These stages are logically coordinated, considering a process of progressive specification in which first appear the features of the class, then of the order, etc., and finally the individual traits. Actually, von Baer's theory didn't completely abandon the idea of organic preformation, but translated it to the plane of from the plane of visible features to that of their generative principles. In this fashion, the two concepts that hitherto seemed to be contradictory, those of order and change, became reconciled. Formative forces were supposed to be plastic enough to lead to the generation of mutually incommensurable forms. In short, it opened the possibility of conceiving the idea of fulgurations historically produced. We find here a first version of the arrow of time. Temporality becomes an intrinsic dimension of being, something internally generated. It is this capacity of self-generation and self-transformation, the presence of an inner formative force, what distinguishes the modern concept of the subject from that of the classical period, from the subjectum that Heidegger spoke about. It is now a generative force, Kraft in German, Energeia rather than Ergon. The power to become something different while remaining the same. We also find here the conceptual premises, the epistemic noun for the conception of history as a singular collective noun that displays temporality of its own in Koselleck's work. Foucault associates these new concepts, this new set of concepts, life, subject, history, with the emergence of the objective transcendentals, duplicates empirical and transcendental. In the classical period, or only the infinite could be the foundations of the finite. In the modern period, we observe instead the paradox that the conditions of possibility of phenomena have become placed on the very phenomenal plane. Things would contain within their conditions of possibility. The rise, to put just an example, the rise of political, economic, and illustrated, with Ricardo, work came to appear as a condition, as a commodity, like any other commodity, which can be exchanged in the market, and at the same time, as the foundation on which the whole exchange system rests. It thus possessed a double nature, empirical and transcendental, one more element within a system, and at once its condition of possibility. It was also the matrix of the modern idea of the subject. It shared that double nature. It was the transcendental condition of possibility of objects, and it itself an object, an empirical being, the result of an objective historical process. So far, it could be said that Foucault's archaeology of knowledge opposes Heidegger's and Koselleck's perspectives to each other and combines their respective insights, thus observing two major epistemic breaks and analyzing the nature of the regimes of knowledge that emerge out of each of them. However, Foucault missed another epistemic break that took place at the end of the 19th century as the result of the collapse of the evolutionary teleological perspective of history. It lastly reveals that his own perspective, like Koselleck's and Skinner's, was still inscribed within that very regime of knowledge that then emerged, and consequently, he could not thematize it. In a previous lecture, I anticipated the kind of bifurcation that I then produced on the level of the regime of knowledge in connection with the emergence of electrodynamics. The transition from a physics of elements to a physics of fields can be the same pattern can be observed also in the field of biological thinking in the redefinition of the concept of organism by the so-called synthetic theory. This transformation began in 1883 when August Weismann postulated the hypothesis of the radical discontinuity between the soma and the germ, between the adult individual and the germ, which led to discard the idea of the transmissibility of acquired characters. This thus cast doubts on Darwin's idea of the mechanism of evolution as the result of the accumulation of minor deviations. Finally, in 1900, Hugo de Vries gave the last blow to that concept, but formulating the principle that evolutionary phenomena on the phylogenetic level result from sudden, global, and random mutations. Bergson and Robertson then gives the example of the eye. It is an incredibly complex organ. It could not be formed gradually. A pupil without a cornea, an iris, or a lens could make no sense. The eye necessarily emerged all at once. The notion of totality or structure was then detached from that of finality function, disassociating in turn necessity and contingency. Mutations were now reduced to unpredictable happenings internally generated, but with no perceivable end or goal. There is no genetic pattern presiding over that series of transformations. The category of totality will now refer to self-integrated systems whose immanent dynamics tend only to their own self-reproduction. Therefore, historicity now could come only from an instance outside systems. It could indicate the action of a transcendental intentional sphere, and the ideas of the author in Skinner, social history, in Koselleck are the ones that play that role in the context of their respective theories. It is connected in turn with the axiomatic nature of all conceptual and physical systems. It is in this context that there emerged the non-Euclidean geometry formulated by Hilbert. As he shows, there is not one sole form of conceiving of space. We can conceive it as flat or curved. And depending on how we conceive it, the laws of geometry will also vary. What is revealed was that the contingent foundation of systems, that they are founded on a series of axioms which are given to them. As Gödel then postulated, the actions of a system cannot be demonstrated within that very system. They thus entail an instituting instant, and the same applies to the social realm. As Max Weber explained, reason can tell us what means we must use to reach an end, but it cannot tell us what ends we must pursue. It leads us beyond the realm of instrumental reason to an ethical field where subjectivity emerges. This dislocated the idea of the objective transcendentals, the conditions of possibility of phenomena were then sent back to the subjective realm. It is normally seen as a regression to the Enlightenment idea of a transcendental subject. However, it actually meant its reversal. The transcendental subject, intentional action, ceased to be the guarantee of order, the same self-substance which remains unmodified under the changes of form that are imposed on it according to Heidegger's formula, to become the source of contingency. As we see, the subject whose death Foucault announced that objective transcendental had already died half a century earlier. Then a wholly new concept of fate emerged. Actually, a subjective process previous to the constitution of the subject, a transcendental ego. It indicated that instituting instant of conceptual system, which for that reason precedes them, refers us back to a preconceptual realm. It actually entailed also a reversal of the subtle side. The idea of history as a singular collective now then became conceptually unfeasible. It lost the conceptual ground that had made it possible. Finally, in the last quarter of the 20th century, we can observe the emergence of a new concept of subjectivity. Now, the radical historicity of social systems could be conceivable only if we think that they are never completely self-enclosed and self-regulated wholes. That is, that in their center lies a void which determines their permanent disjunction with respect to themselves. They are opening to an exterior, which is not just an exterior, but inhabits and founds them. From this perspective, the subject shouldn't be conceived neither something previous to exact structures, as phenomenology conceived it, nor as a mere effect of structure, as structuralism stated, but as an effect of this structure. The constitutive void at the heart of every instituted order is what Derrida named core, the empty place prior to the formation of the world, where, according to Plato, the demiurge inscribed sense. The conditions of possibility of phenomena were then thus sent back again to the objective realm, to the interior of the very system. Yet, it is not a mere regress to the idea of the objective transcendentals of the 19th century, but rather the reversal of it. More than an Urgrund, the Cora indicates a point of fissure. It works as an index pointing to the instant where a given order is dislocated. Temporality will no longer be something that is given to the system from outside, but something that they shelter in their bosom. In their simultaneous necessity and impossibility to be constituted as objective orders, completely self-enclosed and self-regulated systems. A point of reference to illustrate this is the thermodynamic of dissipative structures developed by Ilya Prigogine, Nobel Prize. The notion of event forms an integral part of it, helping to explain the actual behavior of systems far from the state of equilibrium, which Prigogine synthesizes as order through fluctuations. In the context of this new theory, chaos and order can no longer be said as two opposite terms, system and subject, or to refer to two instances within a more general evolutionary process, as it was assumed in the 19th century. Both terms are now inextricably united, although in a very different manner. But to understand it, we have briefly to explain how the time irreversibility of thermodynamical system, function of entropy was traditionally understood. This notion was introduced in physics in 1865 by Clausius, along with the law of thermodynamics, which states roughly that the entropy, that is the degree of microscopical disorder in the universe, always increases as energy tends to become evenly distributed throughout it. A thermodynamic system always tends to its final stage of equilibrium, also called its attractor state. Thus, its final state is always predictable, although not its march to it. For example, a drop of blue ink spilled into a glass of water produces a state that forms unpredictable and changing shapes, although we know the final result, an homogeneous light blue solution. And this solution is stable and elastic to the action from its external environment. If we shake the solution, it will always go back to its original state. It is called the attractor state. Well, by focusing exclusively on this final stage, the only predictable one, Clausius could consider thermodynamic systems as both irreversible and deterministic. The thermodynamic of dissipative structures instead focuses on the intermediary states, those far from the state of final equilibrium, which are the most common in open systems, those in exchange of energy with their environment. A central concept here is that of anomalous or fractal attractor proposed by Benoit Mandelbrot. It is an object which contains not one state of final equilibrium, but infinite ones due to the fragmentation of the phase space. We can figuratively represent it as a dented ball. If we throw a marble into a round ball, it will go exactly to the middle. That is its attractor state. If we shake the ball, the marble will always tend to go back to its original position in the center. Now, let us imagine that we hit the ball, leaving something like a plateau in the middle and two valleys in its sides. We thus introduce a degree of indeterminacy. When we throw the marble into it, it can go to any of the two valleys. Now, when we shake the ball, the marble will always go back to its original position unless it moves beyond the peak of the plateau. If the latter is the case, we can no longer predict where it will go. Well, this peak is called a bifurcation point. A fractal object is like a ball with infinite plateaus and valleys. In that case, the shaking of the ball would lead to complete indeterminacy. Thus, the notion of event becomes a constitutive concept of physical systems. It is what PRECONCEPTUAL called order through fluctuations, a concept that in turn entails that the system possesses two properties. First, they are creative, that is, they are able to create new coherencies different from the original states of equilibrium and unpredictable in them through the action of their own internal activity. Second, as a consequence of that activity leading to successive fluctuations, inherent in this system is the existence of a temporal horizon beyond which we cannot see, either to make predictions to the future or retrospectively to reconstruct its evolution, since beyond that point, all information or memory of its original situation is irremediably lost. Well, we find here a case of time irreversibility in its strong sense. which involves radical contingency, indeterminacy at both its extremes, its point of departure and arrival. 1. We can finally observe how the concept of the subject underwent a number of transformations in the course of the 4 centuries that modernity spans. This obliges us to set into question the assumption of the existence of such a thing as a subject, or indeed a modern subject. Rather than affirming or rejecting the existence of the subject, the point is to investigate the conditions for the emergence of a specific mode of historical consciousness that eventually permitted imagining man as a subject, and how, at a given moment, that type of discourse collapsed, losing the ground of evidence on which it was founded. In conclusion, despite the problems we can find in Foucault's archaeological project, it provides a framework for a much more accurate comprehension of the differences among conceptual systems, how the regime of knowledge changed over time, rendering it impossible the transposition of ideas and concepts like that of the subject from a given period to another, thus preventing the kind of anachronisms proper to the history of ideas. To put it in another way, while we cannot plainly compare the ideas of Hobbes and Hegel, for example, without considering the epistemic bridge that separates their conceptual apparatus, they didn't simply think differently of the same things, but they spoke about different things. Going back to Koselleck and the concept of history, it is not merely a concept. From the subtle side on, we not only think historically, we live historically. We change in the meantime were not the ideas of the subjects, but the world in which they live, or more precisely, their life worlds, the modes of experiencing temporality. And it was an objective change in the modes of constitution of our collective existence, which introduced a bridge, marked a temporal threshold in his intellectual history. The last goal here, therefore, is not to discuss whether the authors we study were right or wrong. When I critically consider concepts such as those of the author in Skin or Social History Koselleck, it is not to refute or defend them, but more simply to understand how it was possible for these authors to conceive them as the sources of conceptual change, and eventually the kind of problems that them generated within the logic of their own theories and according to their own premises. They thus come to reveal the nature of that particular system of knowledge that underlies their theories, of which they are different expressions, and ultimately of the tensions that are constitutive of it. They are inner blind spots, that which prevents them from becoming constituted a fully rational, self-integrated, and logically articulated system. In sum, to disclose the contingent nature of their foundations.